I'm Sasha Nicole.
And I'm Star.
And I'm Dr. T.
And this is American Therapy, the definitive podcast on all things Black mental health. We, of course, are back giving continued content during these COVID times, in our virtual world that we're living in. How's everybody today?
Yeah, good.
Heavy day.
Busy, Yeah.
Heavy day.
Heavy day. Okay. Star, what are we talking about today?
All right, Sasha. Okay, Dr. T. Swirl Girl, mixed race in America.
Ooh. Right. So we have a great guest today. We have Teresa Stovall. Teresa Stovall, who was born a jazz baby in Seattle, Washington, when much of the country was racially segregated and her parents' marriage was illegal in 16 states. Ooh. Her new memoir, Swirl Girl, Coming of Race in the USA, reveals how she grew up battling society and sometimes her closest loved ones to forge her identity on her own terms. Swirl Girl is available at teresastovall.com. She's an author from the age of 7. She's written several poems, books, and plays on various topics, including racial identity and the impact of colorism on people of color. Her books include A Love Supreme, Real Life Stories of Black Love, The Hot Spot, which is a novel, Proverbs for the People, and an anthology of contemporary African-American stories. She is an award-winning journalist whose works have been featured in USA Weekend, The Courier Post, The Montclair Times, The Defenders Online, and several other platforms. She's an official super fan of the OWN television series Queen Sugar. She's a proud mother of a son and daughter, both multi-talented millennial writers and creatives. She lives in Atlanta, loves to stir things up on social media, which was how we met, stirring up things on social media.
All right.
And again, you can find her at teresastovall.com. We'll be providing all that information. She's on Facebook as Teresa Stovall, on Twitter and Instagram as Teresa Talks. So we are excited to have her because this is a show that I've really been wanting to do. Mm-hmm. So, I'm excited. I'm excited that we get to talk about this, that we have her on, and that we're talking about her book. So Teresa, tell us, we know that you wrote the book, Forging Your Own Identity, Being of Mixed Race in This World. How did identity just begin to play out with you growing up?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, everybody. Delighted to be here. Really honored, Sasha, that we're finally getting to meet, be on Facebook. So Swirl Girl, and here's my cover. Swirl Girl is Coming of Race in the USA. It is, thank you. So identity, I was always aware of identity. I don't ever remember not being aware of identity. I think when I was little, I knew that my parents were two different things, before language really kicked in. And I was in a community that I now know was very unusual. And I think I have some unusual kinds of privilege because of this, but I grew up in a community, I'm from Seattle, Washington. So Seattle, Washington, I was born in the 1950s. So Seattle, Washington was the place where there was a lot of interracial marriage. And I was in a community of people when I call myself a jazz baby, and Quincy Jones was part of this community. And he's talked about it as well, of Black men from different parts of the country who were jazz musicians. My father wasn't famous, but he wasn't one of the famous ones, but who were all married interracially, and around the same time in the early to mid 1950s, who worked together to buy houses in the pre-gentrified section of Seattle where Black and other people of color could live, right? And then a small group of people who were my parents' friends when they were married. I just learned this story a few years ago. The women got together and literally, and picture this, early 1950s, there's no reproductive rights, there's no legal abortion, there's really no birth control. And all the women got together and kind of conspired to have children around the same time, and we all lived near each other so that we'd have a sense of ourselves as somewhat normative before we went out into the world, and it worked.
Wow. That is.
Yeah, very different, right? I have to give those women props, and I don't know how involved the men were in the scheme, but women tend to think like that, right? So I give those women a lot of credit. I give them a lot of credit, and but I was always aware because I was around different kinds of people, So in my little baby or toddler brain, I was very strict about categorizing people according to where I thought they went, right? In my little categories. So there was, and my mother was Jewish and first generation American born. And for context, I like to share that when my mother was growing up, my mother and father grew up in North Minneapolis, where Black people and Jewish people were allowed to live. And when my mother was growing up, when I was growing up, Jewish people were not considered white.
No.
Okay, they were still considered minorities. Okay, so I didn't grow up with a sense of all the other moms were white, and in Seattle, white is Scandinavian, so that's like super white. Like really, it's like this is Aryan. That's just straight up Aryan, right?
That's the whitest white.
It's the whitest white. It is really white. So, so anyway, but there was this sense. So you know, there was my mom, and I didn't think of her as white or not white, but there were white people and there were Black people, and there were people who I then put in a third category as something else. And those people like me, but there were people in our world who I now know or knew once I started getting older were Asian, were Samoan, were maybe mixed themselves. And also, very important, people, the migration patterns into Seattle were primarily from Louisiana and then from Texas. And so there are a lot of Creoles there. So just to make things even more complicated, growing up. So I'd be like, and Creoles will tell you they're Creole.
Yeah, they will not claim Black.
Well, they may or may not claim Black, but they're also like, I am Creole, especially in a place where it's a thing, you know. I am Creole. And so I just grew up and I didn't know anything about migration or Louisiana at the time. I just knew that, you know, like Creoles, right? I am Creole. And I was like, is that different than me? Is that the same? Because we look alike. That's who I look like, right over there. And they'd be asking me, there was a well-known Creole family around town, and they'd be asking me if I was a member of that family. So I grew up like, no, I'm not a Gayton. No, I'm not a Gayton. No, I'm not a Gayton. You know, are you a cousin? You know, but anyway, so all those things came together. So I was always, I would say, hyper aware of identity without putting it, you know, there was no hierarchy in my mind. I was just like, I'm around a bunch of different kind of people. I'm trying to make sense of it all.
So when you use the word identity, with you now as a woman today, do you classify or identify yourself as mixed, or do you classify yourself as Black with this rule, you know, that we have, you know, well, if you got any Black in you, you Black?
That's what my book's about. Well, so both. So that's the short answer. So the short answer is that I am mixed, and because I'm so ambiguous looking and very light skinned, that I've spent a great deal of my life explaining myself to people, right? Like I don't ever not get to explain myself to people. So I've been doing that for a long time. So, and what part of the way I describe myself, which recently is, I tell people I'm Black and Jewish or bluish, and the Black comes with a significant part of Native American, but I don't know which tribes on my father's side, and I am pretty much completely Black identified.
How is it navigating, like, or I guess maybe I should take that back. I'm gonna pull back. What is it like, and what point in your life did you realize, like, I'm navigating the world as optically, because like when I look at you, I have a whole slew of family members. I'm one of the few that is actually dark skinned. And so when I look at you, I'm like, oh, she's Black. I don't see nothing else but Black because you look like my family, my cousins and all of them, right? And then I think about like what point in time having what I would consider a white mother, but is identified as Jewish mother, right? Did you realize like I'm a Black woman, or people see me as Black? And then how did that change, or if it changed, how you navigate the world?
So great question. So first, my whole life, including now, people see me as many things. Some of them predictable, some of them not. So if we all met socially and you didn't know me and nobody warned you, because some of my friends warn people. Okay. So listen, let me explain to Ressa. So if you didn't have any context or any information, you'd be like, so, right? And I can kind of, if we're in person, I can see it, I can sense it, and some people just ask. And that's really been, again, my whole life. So the conversation has just always been there. when did I realize I was, that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. I like that. When did I realize I was Black? I don't remember ever not thinking of myself as Black. Now, also when I was growing up, like a lot of younger mixed race people who I know mostly, like Sasha, through Facebook, they have fascinating conversations about things that I can't necessarily relate to, but I'm learning a lot. So there, and some of them, as Sasha knows, are very, some of them are very anti, I don't know that they're anti-Black, but they're very anti the idea that you identify as Black. And they and basically they use one drop as a slur. Oh, you're a one dropper. And I'm like, yes, I am. But in reality, that concept, I don't remember exactly what age I first became aware of that concept, but that concept wasn't a thing when I was growing up. Like it didn't have legs. It wasn't something where we mixed people sat around and said, well, we knew we were people of color. We knew we weren't white, whatever we looked like. We knew we were people of color. We knew we weren't white. And so that, like you said, one drop, so here's an interesting story I talk about in my book. So the only defined identity I grew up with was my mother explained to me, and it's a little more flexible now, but back then, and even so, this is a dominant theme in Jewish identity, which is every bit as complicated as Black identity, believe me, and as controversial within the Jewish community. But all she gave me was a rule. And she said, well, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. I mean, and that was it. That was the entire conversation. And here's why. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was the least ambiguous, most straightforward part of my identity soup, right? The Blackness, and remember, this is the 50s, and I'm coming of age in the 60s. My book starts on the day of Dr. King's assassination. And I'm 13 in 8th grade. And so I'm coming of age I'm in the North, so it's not the Civil Rights Movement, it's the Black Power movement. And so there were conversations among individuals, in public spaces, in music, in movies, on television. What is Black? And it wasn't ever really talked about in terms of blood quantum. It was talked about, well, it's a state of mind, like really, we was vibe. That's how we talked about it. I know it's a long time ago, but it was that intangible thing, right? So when a lot of Black people meet me and they're around me for they go, oh girl, you're just Black. Because you act Black, you talk like that, whatever. So that thing. And so that was something growing up, while I'm just coming of age, I'm also coming of race. That conversation was the public conversation, at least in the Pacific Northwest, but also throughout Black American culture, Soul Train, whatever. Do they have soul? You have songs. We got more soul. Is that Black enough for you? So that was kind of how it wasn't processed like one drop. A few times, usually Black men would be like, yeah, if your daddy's Black, you're Black. I said, that's really not a thing. They were trying though. They were trying. But because the Jewish thing is like thousands of years, and it's actually like Talmudic law. It's matrilineal, and because you grew in their body and fed at their breast and blah 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 blah. So those I was always conscious of how those things were happening, and the Jewish thing wasn't a big public ongoing cultural collective thing, but Black was. Very much front and center. We evolved pretty fast. We evolved from color to Negro to Black, right? Color to Negro to Black. By the time I was a teenager, we'd been through those cycles, and a lot of the adults didn't like Black. They felt it was, like my dad, they felt it was a slur. We young people, yeah, I'm Black, I'm blah, whatever. So the way it was being processed very publicly. Within actual movements. And so I was caught up in all that. And then I asked questions of myself, of other people, like and to learn about the spectrum and where do I fall?
So how does that work? Like you were raised mixed race in a very like utopian mixed race society, right? That probably doesn't exist anywhere ever again, right? So, like, how do people, we're in right now today, we are probably, I think we're on the precipice of the next great piece of the civil rights movement. Like, we're globally marching over police brutality and just basically racism. I mean, so like now, how does a person with a mixed race child, specifically like a white person, because I have 4 white friends who have all got mixed race children, and they have all texted me, what do I do? I'm like, I don't know, you got Google, right? Like, I'm not the ambassador for how to raise a mixed race child. You should have thought about that before you had a baby. Not that, I mean, because I'm going through my own trauma. I ain't got time to be healing, okay? And they know
absolutely, yes,
like,
yes, sorry, I get it.
Give that to, what guidance, I don't know, something you can give these specifically white mothers, because I have friends who have are mixed race and have black mothers, and they're like, nah, I'm black, and they, it's a difference.
And the black mother can give them the tools to navigate blackness, and mixedness is part of blackness, and blackness is part of mixedness in the U.S., right?
So what guidance can you give those parents that have white mothers and don't know what to do, or like, well, asking their black friends, and right now we ain't in the space to be helping nobody but ourselves right now.
Right, no bandwidth. No bandwidth. That's a very good question. I would say to them, well, first of all, I'd probably react a little bit like you could have thought about this, but on the real, if they're sincere, and I think if they have mixed kids, they're probably sincere, right? Like they're looking at this and going, okie dokie.
I'm gonna say this. I think it is a level of racism and bigotry to not have ever supposed it, like that ain't never come in your mind that you marry and bear a child with a black man and have no concept of black reality until right now. To me, and that was part of my reaction, is like, you know how racist that actually is? I'm sorry, Dr. Rice, I'm be glad now.
No, it's I mean, I think it's part of what's going on now. And I think, Teresa, your story is so interesting because it does start in a way that most mixed children don't start, right? So you started from a place of comfort where you could explore these things. And also the other elements that are popping out are, I never thought about how regional the different versions of colorism might be. So where you come of age, North versus South, and what faiths, because as you mentioned, the Jewish faith and the African-American faith are both very, very strong. And to have both of those in the same house, so all of these things that when we think of colorism, we often think of skin tone and the impact that has. But what you're really highlighting is there are so many other nuances, like every other part of Black culture. There are so many other nuances that oftentimes get minimized or distilled down into the generic stereotype. And I think that's why Star, a white woman who has a mixed child may not give it as much thought as you imagine, because when you're young and in love and you have kids, but then you think, you don't really know, right?
I think you're right.
Yeah, I'll jump in here because, Teresa, your story, it has so much complexity. And I read through a lot of the book, and I'm intrigued because, like Dr. T said, Jewish, when I think of like New York, and you remind me of people where I've seen who are Jewish, right? And I've always said Jews to me are Black, like a lot of them have such Black features. But for me, because my mother was from the South, her being white, and my experience being mixed, and race in general, very, very, very different. And for a long time, I thought like, well, I'm mixed. I would say that was my description of
Where'd you grow up?
So I started off in Alaska, spent most of my life in DC and Virginia. Okay. And Virginia being the Richmond corridor, where racism was definitely there for sure. I went to school with people who rode tractor trailers to the school, so it existed. And they wear Confederate shirts and say, well, we're not racist because the flag has puppies on it. And so that was the dynamic. of it. And so my experience, you know, for a long time, I would say that I was mixed. And then when I would go around my dad's side of the family, my aunt would be like, oh, call me the B word. It'd be like, you black. Girl, you black. and the B word in my dad's side of the family, you know, black side, it was endearing. Like if she called me a B, it's because she loved me. Like that was how it worked. I'm saying that because that is the dynamic of the blackness or the black side of my family. Yeah. Whereas my mom, a point to kind of like what Star said, her color blindness or attempt to say that she's colorblind, which she isn't, was so harmful in my dynamic growing up, because she would say things to me like, you're not black, you are mixed, I don't see color. And she would raise me or see me in the lens of, yeah, there are black people, but then there's like the Obama black people. And I want you to be the Obama black people, not your aunt type of black people. Yeah. My aunt represented the subset of like a thoroughbred DC born and raised, you know, from the 50s, like what's up? So and it did a lot of harm. So for me, it has taken such a long time to come into who I am from an identity perspective. Even grasping the idea of, once I finally started to feel like, okay, well, I'm black. The idea that even me being light skinned, like I had a very hard time even identifying that there was any privilege with that, because I felt like, well, the way that I've been treated or the things that people have said, you know, and then in my growing up in middle school and high school, especially when my hair was much longer, or at times where I went through a much more fairer skin stage and had that typical, I guess, like that mixed little girl look, it was like the kids then were, well, you ain't black, like you ain't black enough, your mama white, like, so you don't count. You don't get to talk to us about what black is or civil rights. And then white people, obviously, I'm dark enough where they're like, well, hell, you ain't white, so damn sure don't fit over here. So for me, there has always been, really until adulthood, a struggle with my identity and embracing that, because I never quite felt like I belonged on either side, and each side had always done damage in saying that I wasn't fully one of them. So even in black people to this day, recently on Facebook, I made a comment. I guess the girl went to my profile pictures and saw that my mama was white and said, bitch, you don't even count, because you ain't even 4 black women anyway. You got a white mama. And a few years, like some years ago, that might have really, really hurt. But in this day, it was just kind of like, really? I was taken back, but I was like, you know, whatever. But it's the I'm saying that as the point of, people will discredit anything sometimes that I do when they find out that my mom is white. Mm-hmm. And so I remember, like, when I was reading in your book and you talked about a few things, like one, when you talked about the race issues that started to ensue, and you were like, well, who would come for me? Like what side, you know, would pick me? And then you mentioned how Langston Hughes in that book, Cross, and how he talked about the tragic mulatto and basically not knowing where they belong. And then you referenced the other poem, and I wrote it down. I think Terry Stone. Is it from Terry Stone? Uncrossed?
That's me. That's actually me, though.
Okay.
That was my name as a child.
Oh, okay. Forgive me, but where you know, wrote the poem Uncrossed, and basically defining that you're not a tragic mulatto, that you know who you are. Yeah. And so, you know, but your disappointment that you had with Langston Hughes and saying, you know, basically the tragic mulatto, because oftentimes in that day and age, you know, sometimes being mulatto, especially during slave times, was not a choice. But then now, similar to Star's point, I do believe, you know, when white women choose to have children with, you know, a black man, a Hispanic man, an Indian man, I think that there has to be some sort of declaration of culture or history that they're going to be dedicated to and pouring into that kid, that oftentimes what I've noticed is that white women don't do. And then I feel like the black men, like my father, don't even think about the impact at all, and they're not responsible for teaching anything into the kid a lot of times, you know. So it falls on that mother, and if that white mom doesn't do it, then you're left identifying with whatever that woman has identified you as, you know, until you grow older. So, you know,
That's a good point, and I think it ties back to what Star asked. So Star, I mean, I'm only being a little bit facetious, but you know, I feel what you're saying. I mean, the times we're in are kind of unique right now, obviously, but even before this, when you have a white mother, especially, who has a black kid or whatever, I always facetiously, I don't usually say this to them unless I just really want to be snarky, is it's almost like you should have to get a license, take a test, take a class, right? There should almost be a requirement, right? For the parent, for both parents, of these children on, so you're bringing together your own ancestry, your own, you know, your own ancestry, whatever you know about it, and the history and culture of the groups that make up this kid's DNA, right? So that, because that gives this child something to work with. With your example, Sasha, your experience is much more common, is the common experience, you know that. And I think it's partially because of what Star brought up. And I think a lot of it, like, you know, you're talking about utopian, that sometimes the parents are utopian. Sometimes, let's be honest, there's a lot of fetishizing is a harsh term, but there's a lot of people who fetishize mixed kids. They fetishize the idea of mixed kids. They fetishize the status of mixed kids. And this is people of different races, right? And no less Black people than white people. And so, you know, it's always kind of nauseating to me, but it's very, very common, and we know that. And so you can't always say they're horrible people or whatever, but I find it annoying and tedious. And I do want to say to them, you know, sometimes when I'm being really snarky on social media, I say, you know, not all mixed couples should have kids. But, and I'm not joking. I'm like, I almost feel like there's a course you should have to complete, right? A questionnaire. Nah, yes, you guys are cool. No, y'all don't do it. Get a dog. But because of what Sasha so movingly described, though, because that is the common experience. And so what I call that, you know, we're really jocking the binary. This country's built on a Black versus white binary, let's be honest. That's also why people who are other mixes, sometimes in mixed spaces, Sasha knows, so complain. Why is Black, white always dominant? Sometimes I get tired as an elder breaking it down, but I'm like, because there's almost 500 years of reasons why, and this country is built on that binary, right? And that's what we're going through right now, a virtual or maybe even real race war at some level on that same binary. Okay, we can't, you know, nobody chose that, none of us chose that, but and so with Sasha, what you were put into is the very common position of a harsh either or, where you're a little too much this, or you're not quite enough that, and that's because people, the binary is what everybody knows, right? And they're trying to cram you into it, and they're trying to process you through a lens that doesn't contain you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how have
your
you
whole
been
reality
able to overcome that lens, though? You know, coming from the 1950s, having such a complexity of from Black to Jewish to, you know, so many different hub spots, to now, as you know, how I've met you via social media and seeing that you've been very outspoken from a Black identity. What has helped you get to that place where and maybe perhaps because our situations were different, you never quite struggled with that identity, which is what I gather to the degree is like you recognize that it was there, but that you were able to claim who you were very early on, rather than that struggle of not being enough. Were there certain components or moments, you know, or things that you've told yourself or things that you've done that have helped you acclaim whatever you identify or want to identify as, rather than trying to fit in one area or the other?
That's a great question. I think in my case, and I just thought of this for the first time, so I love that you brought it to me. I really think I claimed the Black people and didn't give them a choice. Like, hi. And they're like, okay, what do we do with her?
Well, I think
whatever you're gonna do, you're not getting rid of me.
I think
I
there's
mean,
another
but you just helped me.
piece,
Does that make sense, Dr. T?
well,
Does
I
that make
think there's
sense?
another piece that you claimed because you grew up in this environment where other was okay and acceptable. There were
Right.
always three buckets in your life.
Yes.
Whereas that binary that you talked about, many people are forced to choose. You always had that third bucket. So then it's a little bit easier because you're going between three buckets and
Right.
it's not this
Right.
hard binary choice. So I wonder, that gave you, if you will, the bandwidth, even as a young child, to be able to see things differently and then ultimately make your own choice about where you want to land. But having that safe bucket to explore from
Yes.
is something that most kids don't have.
Exactly.
Dr. Is there something you can add from a psychological level that we can, like, with what Star was mentioning, that we can give to our kids? So for example, my daughter, who is actually lighter than me, surprisingly, but has way more, like her hair is very coarse, and she has lighter eyes, but her father I did not want a light-skinned child. I wanted a brown baby. I did, because I never wanted them to be in that boat that I felt like I had to be. I wanted them to know they came out black, you black. And so when she came out looking like she had a white dad, I was like, what the hell? I honestly thought that the genetics wouldn't be that strong because he's dark skinned. I'm not super light. I am fairly light, but my mother is not, like, as we said, like the Scandinavian white. She's Irish white, dark hair. So so I'm like, this ain't gonna be a problem. Well, genetics didn't have it that way. And so when she says things, when she finally started to see, oh, there's color. And she says things like, well, how come Yaya, who was my mother, why is Yaya white? Well, I'm white. And I remember for a period of time, she would say, well, I'm white too. And I would say, you black. You black. And so, you blackity black. And I would keep repeating it to her and be like, you blackity black. Like, accept that you black. Because she will really identify by, well, my skin is lighter than yours. I look more like Yaya. Or, and so it's like she just was, well, why does Yaya look this? And then she would talk about Papa, who was my father. And she, well, Papa's dark. Why is Papa black? And so what tools can we give from a psychological level in helping our children identify, because technically my daughter, she is black, she ain't mixed, you can't do that 1/8 shit, like, so, but for someone, like myself, or maybe if I had a child with a white man, like, how do we help engineer, the identity that oftentimes you see so many of us, do struggle with?
So your kids like mine, there's a term in the mixed community called MGM, multi-generational mix, which means you have one or two mixed parents. Okay, so we now have that. So whether it's the Obama daughters or Halle Berry's kids or, whatever, right? MGM, Zoe Kravitz. So, and my kids, interestingly enough, my ex-husband's he's black. He's in that area where some people would call him light-skinned. He's caramely. Right? He has green eyes and he's caramely. That's the only word I can use. So I wasn't, and we weren't sure. Both of my kids my son is basically, my complexion, was born a blue-eyed blonde. He has hazel eyes and reddish brown hair now. He has very black features. My daughter got the only melanin. But she's the only one who's never mistaken for white. Mm-hmm. But she's super ambiguous looking. Brown, she's brown, light brown skin, brown eyes, dark hair, and hair that's just a tiny bit curlier than mine. And so they're as ambiguous, and he's as light as me with light eyes and light hair, right? And I apologized to them. I said, really, I didn't want you, at least the light, I could explain, I felt like I could equip them for the light skin stuff, because that's pretty straightforward and predictable, let's be honest. That's not really, it's not going to really blindside you or anything. The ambiguous thing is a whole nother party. But to answer your question, Sasha, I'm a fan of, in general, and to kind of go to you, Star, and you can send them to me, tell them about my bud. Seriously, girl, seriously, I will, yes, seriously. because people who've read it, white and black and different generations, have said this is a must read for parents of mixed kids and grandparents. But anyway, to go back to your really good question, Sasha, I'm a fan of specificity, and I think what helped me too, Dr. T, was it's like my mother. So we were not exposed. The other thing is the Jewish part of my family wasn't very Jewish religiously at all. Like I don't think any of my mother's siblings were. I don't know if her parents were, but she wasn't. And so when I was 10 or 11, my mother said, she sent me and my brother to Hebrew school, right, on Saturdays, and in the neighborhood. And she said, and she explained very explicitly, she said, this is for historical and cultural reasons so that you'll understand that part of you. So it was like taking a class, right? So we went for a couple of years. And so the way things were, I think it can help if you present, don't get into, how old is your daughter, Sasha?
She's about to be 8.
Right. So, and when she says, Yaya's white, I'm white, we all know children are still literal. So she's literally looking at the color and going white, black, dark, light, she's not coming with all the nuance we project onto it and that we interpret. She doesn't have any of that, right? She's still young. So I'm a fan of when they're young, of talking about their other parents' really specific heritage, right? Like Irish, like, you know what I mean? And with enough, with kids, you got to give them just enough information. With enough information so they start to have some specificity, and in terms of culture and history, not just race, because you know what America does is America overshadows everybody's culture, history, and specifics with race because of racism, right? Does that make sense, Sasha? And you can explain, you can just be straight up with her. You can say, well, Yaya is white / Irish. Here's pictures of Irish people. This is where her family came from. Give them a little history with it, right? Make the people come alive. And so part of me is like Yaya, part of me is like, my father, and he's black and dark, and I'm both, and I'm light skinned and you're light skinned. And when she's in about 2 or 3 years, you can talk about genetics and what I call genetic roulette, which all people of color know about, and all families, like Star was saying, all families know about, right?
That brings up a problem, to me, a problematic point in, we don't know our genetics. Like, I'm black, my whole family is black.
You're black.
Because that was stripped from me. So, like,
yes.
You can talk about Irish or Jewish. We don't know where we came from, by and large,
By and large, West Coast of Africa. I got you. Yes, you're right.
But I just don't know that. So I think that brings up another level of complexity, because Black is not really even a thing. It's not a place, a location. It's something, an oppressive system applied to us. So I can't all I can tell you is about the history up until the point of like slavery. And that's a small piece of who we actually are as highly melanated people.
Yeah.
Dr. T, can you come in here from
Yeah, so what I was gonna say is, I think, I would agree with pretty much everything that Teresa said, but I would expand it, because as Star said, it's hard for Black people to talk about where you come from, because nobody knows, and now you have all these DNA tests, which, I'm not quite sure I believe, because I'm like, how do they know the genetics of people all in? They haven't studied. I don't know. I'm not that big of a fan of those, but I think that if you talk to them about just erasing the binary situation that the US wants to put us in. And so, yes, you might have gotten this piece of your personality or your characteristics from Yaya, but you're funny, like, I don't remember what you said, she calls your dad, Pop Pop, or you have feet like your daddy, and so all of us get all kind of traits, and skin color is just one of those traits. And yes, a lot of people are going to make assumptions about you based on that one trait, but helping her to know that she's a whole conglomeration of a whole bunch of people, and she got a lot of good things from a lot of people, and some things that she may not like from a lot of people in her family. But really helping her see that even though the world is going to approach you based on the color of your skin first, there's a whole bunch more about yourself that you got from everybody. And let's not all focus on that, at least not in this house, right? And so that helps her start to break out of that binary bind of, you know, I gotta be this or that. And she will have to face that, and you will have to have more complicated conversations as she gets older. But I think when they're younger, helping them learn to appreciate their whole selves and not get caught in the system that we all know is coming.
I love that. I love that. And just to add to that, oh, I'm sorry. Just
go ahead. Just look, come on, now you the guest.
just real quick. But I love that, Dr. T. Thank you. I love that. And also, Sasha, you know, my tagline for my book is living and in a world of either or. You are and you can teach her that she is and I taught my kids that. So like I said, you got 3 Black grandparents and a bubby. So however you choose to move through the world with that, that's what you got. 3 Black grandparents and a bubby, right? You got a big daddy, you know, what they call it, and granny, and then my dad was already passed away, but you know, my dad and a bubby. And so they, you know, and it was, again, you know what I mean? So I think that everything Star and Dr. T have said, and does that make sense though, Sasha? Does that work for you? You represent and to say, don't let the world try to force you out of your reality, stand in your reality.
I think for me, you know, it comes down to, you know, I had to find within, for me, for myself, my identity. I related more, felt like I identified more with Black because I was accepted more, you know, probably is the reality, even with the comments of, well, you ain't all the way Black type of thing. But for a long time, it was just, I didn't want to erase that my mother didn't exist. Like, I didn't want to be like, oh, well, I'm Black, and then just eradicate the fact that my mom is white, or the fact that because of my upbringing that I wasn't placed in certain situations where I saw the perspective from a different lens. And I felt like by only claiming that, then I'm erasing this woman who does exist, who did bring me into this world. And so now for me, from a technical standpoint, you know, if I'm talking about it or someone asks, like, the reality is like, yeah, like my mother is white, you know, from a technical standpoint, if they had mulatto on the paper as something to identify with, the paper reads, my DNA reads that is what I technically am. From an identity standpoint, I think for me, I've reached the point where I identify as a Black woman in America. But I know, and I'm okay with being able to navigate through that now in my 30s and say that without feeling as though I'm erasing my mom, but know that, you know, from a technical standpoint, that yes, my mother exists. Yes, I am mixed, but this is who I identify as. This is who I relate to, or this is who I struggle with. This is who I bleed with, or this is who I fight for. And it doesn't erase, you know, my mom, but it just happens to be that, you know, this is what I am in this world, in the world that we live, you know, like this is just what it is. And I think even for my mom, her identity of me changed the more that I began to discover what I identified as. So it's like now I think our conversations from race are more driven towards the reality of what Black people are facing, rather than this spectrum of, well, you know, Sasha, like, you know, I don't see color, and Martin Luther King was a great guy. And it's like, that's crap. Like, that's not what is existing right now. And so I think my identity has even helped her realize, you know, because she would try to downplay the narrative of race in this country. And I think that is a failure for children, you know, where it's like, when I went in the world saying, no, but that's not true. Or, you know, I can be this other subset. And that's where, you know, I do think that, particularly white women, and even if a Black woman chooses to have a child with a white man or another race, like, that woman has to prepare culturally. What does that mean? Because my mom at one point was married to a guy from Pakistan, and she converted to Islam. And so for a big portion of my life, I actually was raised in this, in being, I, you know, obviously at that young of an age, but she raised me being Muslim. So I knew the Quran, I couldn't eat pork, all this crap. Not to say crap like I'm dismissing, Muslim beliefs, but that was so far off from what I knew from Black culture or the previous white culture before, this Pakistani guy came to my life. And so if she had actually had a child with this man who was Pakistani, you bring in a whole nother subset of culture and that identity of that child, so.
I think, it's so important that a lot of parents don't think about development. And one of the developmental lines is your development of self. And race is a part of that. Culture is a part of that. And all children go through it. And I think race is a bigger part of that self-identity for children of color. Whether you're brown as in Mexican or Black as in African American, I don't know that white children go through the same process of racial identity because it's just, everybody just accepts that that's what the majority is. And so if you're thinking about how you help your child, first of all, you have to understand that this is a process. And I think that's where your friends who are white moms, they didn't go through that part of a self-identity. So they're not cognizant of how important it is going to be for their child. And so maybe just helping, parents of mixed race children think about identity development, because we talk a lot about race, but really what you ladies are talking about is your identity. And that identity development occurs over time, and it is fed by a whole bunch of cultural pieces, a whole bunch of pieces from the external world. But it's a process that happens over time. And so you have to constantly nurture it and feed into it. You want your child to be altruistic, and you want your child to be generous, and you want them to be kind. Those are all parts of their identity that you'll develop over time.
But when you have someone like a Dak Prescott, I'm sorry. But when you have someone like a Dak Prescott, who says, when people will be like, "You ain't mixed, boy, you Black," like, how do we allow people to embrace that is their identity? He identifies as a multicultural man because that is what his mother is white, his father is Black. But how do we move past that and allowing people to identify as what they genetically are, rather than trying to label it as like a Rachel Dolezal, like, no, if your daddy Black, you Black, that type. Like, how do we move past that structure to, of that?
Well, I don't think we can move past it because, like Teresa said, it's innate in our biological DNA to need to categorize people. That's just an innate thing. The cavemans needed to know who was safe and who was danger. And so our brains are wired to categorize. And so the thing is to accept that all categories are okay, rather than to try to get people to not categorize, because that's like in the most basic parts of our DNA. And so if we just are getting to the point where we can understand that there are many, many categories and all of them are okay. No one is better than the other. And that's really where I think we're stuck right now in our society. And what we're seeing is the result of not having enough categories for everybody to feel like they have a place.
Yeah. I guess, I hear all of this, and there's a side of me that's like, where is the person of color parent at in this? Because I get what you're saying, Dr. T, the mother, because race isn't a thing, maybe, or racializing what isn't a thing in how they were brought up. But a Black person that chooses to have a child, or any person of color, have a child with someone who's white, I have to think, so what's going through your mind? You're not preparing your child. They're just as much your child. You know what it's like to move and traverse the world in a Black body, and knowing that Black is not even a real thing, but as categorically a Black body. I don't know. I'm at a point, an angst point, also because of, what times we're living in. So I'm like, what the hell is really going on? And then what does that say about you and how much you love yourself and your people and your own Black identity? And even like my friends that have mixed race children, or my friends who are mixed race, they don't really even understand the breadth of Blackness. I grew up in an affluent Black family, in a community of affluent Black. My parents met each other at an the only all Black boarding school in America. Like, so I don't, like, and not understanding all of that context and richness of our culture, it just seems like I understand how you could say, okay, I didn't have that perspective, but you know what it's like to walk down the street as a white woman with a Black man. You know that everybody's staring at you and look, especially if you grew up back in my parents' time, even now, like, you know, it's like, you know, you try not to look. I'm just being very honest. Like, you like try, especially if you see a Black woman with a white man. Now everybody's like, you know. So I don't know. I feel like those choices are part of a level of self-oppression, white supremacy that we as people of color and white people have agreed to. And like, are you telling your children as a white parent or as a Black parent, like how hey, this is how I show up racist. This is where I show, yes, I'm with your father or your mother, but these are my biases that I'm trying to work through. When I see a big Black man, I do get nervous. When I deal with a Black woman, I feel off guard because I don't know how she's gonna perceive me, you know, and just having more honest context, because clearly these things are part of our society because we're experiencing what we're experiencing right now. So it's not happenstance. You know, it's not, oh, it just seeped into the ether. We're just not, to me, we're not being very honest.
I think like with my father, for example, I mean, big Black dude, 6'3", military, and I don't even think that certain things existed in his mind. You know, when I look like my father, even growing up in DC and stuff, it's like he never talked about race. He never talked about color. He never talked about what it was like being Black in the military in the 80s, when they could put their hands on you and call you the N-word if you wasn't doing something back in the day in the military. So I think it's a conditioning for people. A lot of times when you say, where is that parent of color? I think oftentimes that parent of color is not even acknowledging that, or maybe there's a trauma associated with that they just don't even address. And my father is not deeply dark skinned, but he is dark skinned. But it's like he never has been like, this is what it was like for me being a Black man in America. So, you know, the only person that I ever had to rely on for my experience from a color spectrum was my mother. Mm-hmm. And then the Blackness that I learned was not from my father, but then from my aunt, who was a Black woman. So my grandfather, who's from Philly, is very, very fair skinned. So, you know, and he never talked about race, and they grew up like in the race wars. So it's like my great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother, who was a slave, very, very, very dark skinned. I remember her because she died at like 96. And I remember asking her, if we was in Philly, I was like, how do you live so long? And she said to me, I'll never forget, I eat butter every day. And that's what she said. But it's like, you know, no one from a patriarch standpoint, the men, I didn't have the experience of men of color, or that other parent of color, as you say, Star, ever discussing with me the cultural perspective of which you speak of. And I think a lot of times mixed kids don't have that. They either have one or the other oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you met my dad. My dad, like when I remember this vividly, because the Cabbage Patch, I'm older, I'm 40, and I'm the first generation to ever have a Cabbage Patch doll. And the first one, they didn't make these, back when I was a kid, until I probably was 8, they didn't make Black dolls at all. And my dad was like, my mom bought me a Cabbage Patch for Christmas. And I remember maybe a year later, my dad said, no more white dolls. Like race was very very much a part of our family conversations, ethnicity, all those things. I remember I have kind of like different hair, right? I'm dark skinned and I have this like crinkly, wrinkly hair. So people have always been like, ooh, ooh. And I remember my mother and my grandmother had told me, they're like, oh, don't get wrapped in that. That's racism. That's someone teaching you that a part of you is better, or like, you know, is more valuable because of its proximity to whiteness.
And I think that it's not just mixed race children where these conversations aren't happening. It's I mean, you were fortunate to grow up in a family where that was overtly discussed and explicitly stated. But in many families, I think that the conversations around race are so difficult, whether it's two Black parents, one Black parent, one other parent. The conversations are difficult, and most parents wait until something happens and then they broach the subject with their child, right? So either you grow up in a Black household and you just kind of know you're Black because it's just kind of obvious, or you grow up in a Black household and you go out into the world and you have an experience and then your parents say, okay, let's talk about this, right? But most parents don't know how to have those conversations with their child, and they're not starting at 8 and saying, okay, this is what it means to be Black in America. They're not, you know, and it just depends. I mean, I found out later that my grandparents were very involved in the civil rights movement, but my dad never talked about it. My grandmother never talked about it. My grandfather passed away when I was really young. And I think the trauma of him passing away made them just never talk about it. And one of my friends, who is like a Black history buff, she said, hey, I was reading this book, and isn't your grandfather Clarence Royster? And she's like, there's a chapter about him. And I'm like, what? Like, so it's just not discussed in most Black families. And I don't know if that's because of the trauma. I don't know if it's because we don't know enough, or I just don't know if it's because we're trying to spare our kids the pain as long as we can. And
but
we know that one
you
day,
grow up in an affluent Black family.
no ma'am.
Star,
No,
you
ma'am.
pointed out, I think, Star, you pointed out something that for a lot of, and I don't want to say a lot to try to diminish that there weren't a lot of Black affluent families, but I know my dad's side, there won't, and my mom is what you would probably describe from a white stereotype, as she came from the white trash. Mm-hmm. My father's side, Black, was not affluent in any regard. They didn't grow up with the worst, but, you know, they weren't affluent. So I never, you know, had like affluent. So I think that, you know, there was a certain luxury that you had similar to Teresa and her experiences of complexity and culture and things, where it's like, your ability to see things from a lens is almost like a privilege in a way that other families didn't have discussions on. And I think that has to do with the level of education and experiences that your parents had that a lot of other Black families, you know, didn't have.
Yeah, and generationally, just to jump on this, so Star, you're 40.
Yeah.
So your parents are probably my age.
They're 70. They're like 69, 70. My mom's passed, but my dad is 70.
And I'm 65. So yeah, so we're the same generation. So that's the Black pride, you know, we were the first generation of Black people, right? Who was vocal and overt, not all of us, but you just told me, and I love what you said about the affluent and everything. You know, they went to the boarding school, which is essentially an HBCU at a young age. So they were immersed in something that very few of us, very few Black people, right? Anywhere, right? At least in the United States, get anything near that. So like you said, it's a form of advantage or privilege or whatever, one to cherish. And I also love the message you got about your hair, like, that's real nice, don't trip.
Yeah,
right?
like
I tried to do with my kids. I used to tell my kids, people are gonna I said, you're cute. You're both cute. You got cute parents, you're cute. And you know, I said, you're cute. I said, but people are going to get, especially my daughter, because her hair is more like mine. My son's is more African hair. I said, people are going to get way too excited about your skin color, Calvin, your eye color, Mariah, your hair, right? Because colorism is also hairism and featureism. We all know. But like you said, Sasha, my daughter has light eyes. My ex-husband had light eyes. That's a whole nother, right? It all works. Yeah. And so I try to do the same thing, again, being from your parents' generation, of just telling them, that's really nice, don't trip. People are going to trip off of you, but don't you trip. you know.
I came home and I was like, and my mother was like, don't even do that. Don't even. I'm like, because this little bald head girl. And my mother was like, who are you?
Well, what?
So as we wrap up, Teresa, like anything you can add more about your book without giving too many details away, but just talk about like just anything that you want people to know about Swirl Girl, what you think that people could benefit from it. Like you said, you really think that this could help, you know, mothers who have mixed children and all types of things. Like just add a few details, you know, and last words that you'd like to add to the conversation.
Thank you. Can I just say though that I think the four of us should just get a TV series. I think we're great together. I just want to say that. This is so, I'm learning. Every time somebody talks, I'm like, ooh, I should be, okay, what? I just want to compliment, you know, you guys are awesome. And hey, anytime you want to have me. So Swirl Girl, Coming of Race in the USA. It's available at Amazon. It's also available, I publish independently, partnering with a brother here in Atlanta. So it's my name, all one word.com. So teresastovall.com, or just Google it. So I found out my daughter bought a copy. And I'm like, how'd you find out about it? I didn't really, you know. And she said, oh, Mom, I Googled you. It wasn't hard. So anyway, millennial. So, you know, teresastovall.com, or just Google Swirl Girl. And you can, on Facebook, as Sasha knows, I rabble rouse as Teresa Stovall, same name. Instagram, which I'm just learning about. Y'all, it's so sad. Boomers on Instagram, Lord have mercy. You know, it's slow. I'm like, what? How come I can't get it on my computer? But I'm learning. I got coaches. I didn't know that. I spent 2 weeks. And then they're like, no, Teresa, just on your phone. Like D Nice is on your phone. Just, yeah, do that. At Teresa, it's at Teresa Talks, and on Twitter, where I'm a little more fluent. And I just want to encourage everybody, the feedback I'm getting, and this was my hope in writing the book. Okay, I wanted to write the book. What my work is about is trying to fight systemic racism, and my focus is Black people and mixed people, because I feel like this is my purpose in life, and I want to do everything I can to bring us together so we can have solidarity. So all the little ways that we've been programmed and internalized for centuries to turn against each other in big, small, and medium ways, including colorism and everything else, I want to bring us together. And all the things Sasha so movingly described, whether you're mixed or you're Black or whatever, how we, and just like the athlete, that we begin to broaden the categories that the people can use, like Dr. T said. So that's what Swirl Girl is about. People have said it's a really good book for parents and grandparents. I have a ton of Black girlfriends who didn't expect to, but ended up with mixed grandkids. And I'm like, I'm here for you. Seriously, Auntie is here. Seriously, right? Especially the Black Jewish ones, and there's several of those. So I'm just like, hey, now you know why we've been friends for 30 years. But I finally can come in handy, right?
Well, me and my husband got divorced. I'm Black, blackity Black. I love Black men.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, and that's what I tell people. I am Black identified. I am basically, let me help you, because a lot of people who know me have struggled with this. I am basically Black identified. Yeah. You know, I am basically Black identified. Like I tell people, you'll like this, Sasha. I said the only thing ambiguous about me is the way I look. Like if you want to know where I fall politically, culturally, it's real easy.
Gotcha.
Right? And I love Black people, and I want my thing is working with us to have us and to strengthen us.
Absolutely. Dr. T, what say you?
I think this whole conversation has really brought me back to this word that I've been on this week, is compassion. It is hard being anything in this world. It's certainly hard being Black, and it's hard not knowing and trying to figure out who you are. And so we all need compassion and grace as we walk that path. And we're gonna step in some buckets at some time and other buckets at other time. And we're gonna, I have cousins that have been all over the place with their identity. And we have to love them through that and love them with that. And so if parents, because parents oftentimes want their kids to be a reflection of themselves, and you need your child to have the space to be who they're going to be. And so that takes a lot of compassion.
That's a good one. Ooh. All right. Is it my go, Sasha?
No.
You got two, right?
Two things. I have two things. So first, I would say, because now look, okay, I'm the fight the power, and I've been fighting the power all week on Capitol Hill virtually, and kicking and screaming, because we're gonna get something done on police and law enforcement reform, and we're not gonna let them soft pedal us and provide us some BS legislation to get us out these streets. But anyway, so my two things are just, we don't have to define ourselves based on whiteness, based on terms, derivations, and how we align to Eurocentric culture. And I think if we can start to disengage from that, then some of this, like who we are is about, like you said, Teresa, like Irish and our actual history and the makeup of our lineage and our family members, not about where we fall on some made up scale of whiteness. And I think that will be the most powerful thing that all people of color can do, one of the most powerful things we can do to break the system. Because we play and operate very much so within the confines of whiteness, even when we don't want to and we try not to. So that's my first thing. And then second is gratitude, because I like literally I've been getting phone calls and texts and like, what do I do? I have children and this is my, tragic white woman voice, not tragic mulatto, but tragic white woman. I don't know. And I have a 10-year-old and he's Black. And I just realized he's Black in America. And so I have gratitude. While that did, that really did annoy me, given like my background and how I grew up. But I go to Dr. T's having compassion. No, I am not your teacher. It is not my priority, and I will not do it. But there's a thing called Google, and you can get at it. But I have gratitude for you, Teresa, for writing a book and being honest about your background, who you are, unapologetic about it, and providing a resource for that community, your community, because I have no understanding of it. And some of it seems like, I have my own ideas about it, but I do see that it is a continuum and a complexity. So I'm grateful, because every Black woman and Black man that have your friends asking you about how to help with their mixed children, tell them go pick that book up, Swirl Girl, and get out your face.
Yes.
I guess to close us out, it's surprisingly, what I did like that you said, Teresa, and what I like that Star just used was the word unapologetic, because I know for me, I went through life almost apologizing, for something that I couldn't have controlled. And I think that if I had spent more time being unapologetic of whatever it was that I chose to identify as, then maybe acceptance would have followed, because I wouldn't have been concerned in either category, right? And so I think that being able for people to learn how to be more unapologetic about whoever it is that they want to be, and so I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is, what Dr. T said with the word compassion, ironically, even though, I will self-identify as Black or identify with Black issues, it is my struggle that I had and what I identified with and as an acceptance that then, what I heard earlier in this conversation that made me think of who I've been as a mother and what I wanted my daughter to identify as. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that's a big thing, because I pushed, that off on her, like, no, you Black, like you Black. And so it's like, and to the credit of, she is Black. However, as a child, children should have the freedom to explore those things and identify those things in a way of their own, rather than, through the parents' lens of identity, because of something that honestly and transparently that I've struggled with and that I did for quite some time in my life. So, that this has been even a great conversation for me, and thinking about that and the questions, because I teach her so much Black history it's like I almost want her not to know or think of anything else but that. And I think in doing that, she could potentially lose the compassion for others. So, and I don't want her not to have that. So I thank you, Teresa, for being on. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you all. And Star, you look like you didn't change your mind and went to the nail salon. Your nails looking real nice out there. Mrs. Staying in the house. They looking real manicurish.
You are the fifth person. I have 3 nieces who live, we live on a compound, and they live next door, and they did my nails. They gave me, the dip nail.
They did.
I did not go to a nail salon.
They did a very, very good job. And I can come over with a mask on.
That's right. We're about to make a point.
Underground nail salon.
Yes. We love y'all. Thank y'all for tuning in. American Therapy, all platforms, American with the K, YouTube, all of that. And thank you again. And we out.
All right.